Prairie and...
There we go. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. This is Pauline Drobney, and I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a regional biologist focused on prairie and savanna work. My colleague is Amanda McColpin, and she is the project coordinator for, one of two project coordinators for the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. The other one is Paul Charland, and I am the science coordinator. And today we have some exciting stuff to introduce all of you to. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, but this organization is really an organization of many organizations and of people who are interested and excited about trying to learn to do prairie plantings better. And this organization began in response to a problem. Oh, gosh. Hold on. Oh, shoot. Sorry about this. All right, in response to a problem, and that is we know that in the Midwest, throughout the Prairie Range, but particularly in the Midwest, if we want to do conservation work, we really have to know how to plant prairies. We have to plant prairies because the landscape was dominated by prairie, but now, as we all know, it's almost completely gone. So in order to create habitat for the wildlife we care about, in order to create a semblance of natural systems or to buffer prairie remnants that we hold dear, we need to know how to do good plantings. And it's an expensive process, or it can be an expensive process, and we invest a lot of time and energy in trying to do it. Sometimes we have a planting like this, which is full of beautiful, cheerful flowers, and we would love to see this in early plantings, and sometimes these plantings evolve into a much more diverse planting, but sometimes when we don't include other species in the mix or for whatever reasons, we may end up not going forward into a more highly diverse prairie planting, but what we might end up with is something that kind of fizzles out through the years. And that could happen for a variety of reasons. But sometimes we get a very nice prairie planting like this, where the species that are moisture-loving species are growing in the low, wet areas like prairie blazing star, rattlesnake master, Indian plantain, and many other species. And then other species, the more mesic species, like the pale purple coneflower, the butterfly milkweed, the prairie coreopsis, and thimbleweed, are growing in the upland, or drier, a little bit drier, more mesic areas. And filling in the interstitial tissue are things like, in this case, sedges and other kinds of graminoids. And so this is something that we might feel pretty good about, but how did we get there? Sometimes we think we have a pretty good idea, and sometimes we have this unexpected result. Perhaps we could have predicted it if we had known enough about the site or about other factors that influence plantings, but we end up with something really terrible looking, full of thistles and exotic species. I see sweet clover in there, both yellow and white, and it's not at all what we're after. How did that happen? And sometimes, you know, we just think, well, okay, plow it under and start over. But my friend John Judson from Diversity Farms, who is a prairie seed producer and a contractor who installs plantings, tells me he can get to a highly diverse planting from there, and he doesn't fear the thistle anymore. So what's he doing that we're not doing, or are there particular conditions that are different about his sites than there are about some of the other sites that we have to deal with? One of the questions that we're not exploring is how to do a grass planting. We're not concerned about plantings that are very poorly diverse by design. You know, we're no longer interested in trying to figure out how to do 3 grasses and 5 forbs, so we're just not going to go down that path. However, part of the question we are interested in is that if we end up with a grass-dominated planting like this, and we had intended for it to be highly diverse, or even moderately diverse, then we're interested in that. How did that happen? Why did it happen? because ultimately many of us are interested in having something that looks like a prairie remnant, functions more like a prairie remnant, and is relatively weed resistant, and that is sustainable through time. So how do we get there? How do we get there? What's the most important thing for us to think about when we do a prairie planting in order to achieve consistent results that are desirable? That basically, if we plant it, do we get those species that we planted in the proportions that we're interested in? Is it most important to understand what the site history was? What was that in before? Was it in beans? Was it in corn? Was it in smooth brome, pastured? What are the things that influence the planting before it was even started? Is it about the seed mix? Is it most important to know what the seed mix is? Or how about how the planting was established? What kind of cedar was used? How about post-planting management? We know all of these things influence a planting and the character of the planting through time, but we don't really have a good understanding of how these things interact and which things are most important in leading to a prairie planting. So the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is a group of people. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Advisory Team, which we call PREAT, is a group of very dedicated people who work very hard on working groups to discover the answers to particular problems or to develop tools to help us get to our objectives, reach our objectives. And today we're going to focus on a couple of results of those teams because we don't know exactly what are the most important things to do. We think that there's a number of things, like I've shown here, that influence how the direction that a prairie planting goes. One of our teams, led by Diane Larson of USGS, was focused on doing a retrospective research project. And in this case, we had used two stations in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that had good planting records, one in northwest Minnesota and one in central Iowa, and used that kind of information and did monitoring and tried to tie all of this information to see if we could gain insights into what most influences success. And there was a variety of different types of plantings that we looked at. And so I just clue you in that there's a paper and a note that's going to be coming out in probably the next issue of Ecological Restoration. The paper, the lead author is Diane Larson, and the note is by Ben Walker as lead author. But the point I want to make here is an important thing that we learned from these experiences is that even though we thought we had good data about each of the plantings that we were working with, we found that our understanding was incomplete. There were some gaps in our knowledge that prevented us from truly understanding what led to the outcome that we saw in our monitoring results. So if you have a planting, you put a planting in, let's say you monitored all of you recorded everything you did, but maybe there was, as a case of a planting that I wrote a seed prescription for, someone who was installing the seed mix ran out of seed. There were two sets of seed mixes, one that had a preponderance of forbs and the other one that was a mix of grass and forbs, and they ran out of the one with grass and forbs. And I didn't know about it for about 3 or 4 years, but I could see there was something really going wrong on the planting. It happened to be one that I was monitoring pretty intensively. What went wrong? Well, it's important, whether we think they're mistakes or not mistakes, to record what we did. And actually that has led to some kind of interesting insights, but we just need to know, have a no judgment kind of approach to this, and to try to learn. So everybody who touches those plantings has some part in data integrity. we need to find a way to record that information. If we don't write it down, we can't learn from it. So the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, the two showcase pieces for us right now involve a database where we hope to record information about various phases of planting and management afterwards, and to do it with a crowdsourced, do it by crowdsourcing the information. So this is where the larger Prairie Reconstruction Initiative members come in. This is where you're really important to the process. So one of the things I didn't mention before is that the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is this 20-member advisory team that are really the workhorses of the PRI, the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, and then there's also members who are kind of at large. And these people have the opportunity to attend webinars like this, to come to field days where we discuss, we try to sort of chew the fat and try to figure out specific problems how are things working in a prairie planting. But you can also, those members can also now begin to enter data and actually become part of the solution to the problem. So one of the things that we've done is with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've developed a database. And you may hear a lot about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as we're talking, because this is the organization that has provided most of the power in getting funding and providing leadership for the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. The second piece that another working group has worked on very hard is development of monitoring protocols. These monitoring protocols are designed to be able to understand what diversity is being expressed in the field, and so in other words, if you planted it, did it grow? And what other things were there that you didn't see, that weren't in the seed mix, or that you didn't detect in the seed mix? And the second piece is understanding changes through time on a planting. The protocols have been developed and were tested last summer, but we're not ready for release on those. We have more work to do. So stay tuned. At another time, we'll be able to tell you more about that. But today, we are going to introduce the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative database, and I'm going to turn the controls over to Amanda, because Amanda is the person who is going to be managing the database, who's going to be doing the training, and the person you're going to need to get a hold of if you want to join us.
So hi everyone, I'm Amanda McColpin, as Pauline said. I've been working really hard on the database, and I would like to acknowledge the database team leader right now is Ben Walker up at Glacial Ridge, and we have really been we've been working really hard with a contractor at Chicago Botanic Garden to design the database and make it as good a database as we can make it. So a bigger team had come together to design the database. As Pauline said, we want to try to capture these crucial pieces of information that will help us understand what happened when a reconstruction succeeded and what happened when it maybe wasn't so successful. We can think of the database as capturing information about 3 distinct phases of the reconstruction process. The first being the site information. So Pauline alluded to this. So we're interested in, and we have fields where you enter information about the location, about the soils present, the types of soils present on the site, about the site history, whether it was cropped, what type of crops were in there, what the herbicide history was, whether it was grazed, and maybe some of it had established vegetation. So there might have been a grass waterway, or it might be a remnant pasture that you're trying to, not a remnant pasture, but a pasture that you're trying to now make into a reconstruction. The second and major piece, and probably the part that most of us think about the most, is the planting process itself. So what kind of site preparation did you do, if any? What species were you planting, and in what proportions? And then were those seeds, were they bulk collected, or were they individually collected or purchased? Was the seed cleaned? Did you have seed tests done? You know, all these things are places to record all these little pieces of information that have an influence on the outcome of the planting. In addition, what methods did you use when you were planting? Was it broadcasting? Did you drill the seed? Were you broadcasting by hand? And what was the timing of the planting? Was it winter? Was it spring? Was it summer? And what we ask of you is to try to pinpoint the time in as narrow a window as possible, because obviously the date of planting has a big influence, or past research has shown that the date of planting has a big influence on the outcome. And then in addition, in many spots in the database, there are places where you can attach supplemental materials, for example, maps. And this particular map is kind of cool because what they did was they put an iPad with the tracking function on into the tractor during the planting event. And so those squiggles show Ben exactly where the tractor was while it was spreading seed. Then another really important part of reconstruction is the ongoing management through time. I mean, it is so easy to focus on getting the site and thinking about the site and doing the planting process, and then you manage it, but actually making sure that you get all those management actions recorded. So depending on what type of action you're doing, in other words, is it burning or grazing or mowing, you get different fields to give some more detail about the timing and extent of that action. And sometimes you're only, you know, controlling something in a particular spot. So this guy who's using a handheld weed eater to mow versus doing maybe a burn across the entire unit. And then, of course, the timing, again, the timing of the management action really impacts the outcome that you will get the next year and in subsequent years. So each action is documented individually. So each, you know, one burn would be one management action, and then you would give the date of that burn. And then if you had to mow early in the year and then again late in the year, maybe there were two different species that you were trying to control through mowing, those would be two separate entries so that you could for each event, for each action, you had a small window of time, just so that we can pinpoint these things, because this was one of the main things that when we did the retrospective research that Diane found out, that maybe you recorded that there was a burn, and maybe you even recorded that it was a partial burn, but you didn't indicate which part of the unit. So here again, it doesn't have to be necessarily a proper GIS map to help you figure, help us figure out later whether or not the burn impacted that part of the planting. And there's also places to record management triggers. What exactly was the condition that made you decide to do that management action in the first place? So that is really a brief overview of the parts of the database themselves. And our idea is that, as Pauline said, if we get a lot of people using the database through time, that we will be able to tease out which things we ought to keep doing and which things we ought to change in order to get results that we'd prefer. So as Pauline said, the status of the database right now, we're just putting the final adjustments on the database, and we hope in the next month or so to be able to start having people enter their new data, and we're very excited to do this. And to make everything run smoothly, we've decided to start having people kind of join up in little cohorts. So we'll start, I don't know, 10 or a dozen people and then start another dozen. And so over the next several months, we hope to get more and more people using the database. And the way we envision it right now is that we'll ask people to put in their recent plantings. You can put in old plantings, past plantings, but what we have found is that the older the planting is, the more tenuous the details that you have. So you know, it's just easier. You readily have most of the details that we're asking for new plantings. And so we figure that if people start with one or a few newish plantings now, that then as the database builds, we can kind of build capacity. Yeah.
So one thing that I think we meant to add, and I don't want to neglect this piece, is that you don't have to do monitoring. We plan to provide that tool to anyone who is working with a prairie reconstruction and wants to use that as a tool, and it will provide, as I mentioned, those reports that are useful. I think some managers have indicated already that, boy, that would be really a handy thing to do, to be able to see, are we moving towards a good place, or are we moving into something less, a less savory place, shall we say. And, but we don't require any monitoring to be done. So those of you who are out there and are good at keeping data, we want you to enter your data too, even if you don't enter monitoring data, even if you don't monitor, because ultimately our plan is to develop funding to have a large monitoring event among many plantings that have very good, where people have done a very good job of entering the data. So then you can benefit from that if you're a part of that larger effort too. So just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
Yeah, thank you, Pauline, for mentioning that. And, you know, this final, we just wanted to thank the people on Prairie, who obviously it's not just me and Pauline who have been involved in this. There's a large number of people who have helped with developing the database and thinking about the database and testing and critiquing it. And also we obtained photos and, as Pauline said before, funding and leadership support from Fish and Wildlife Service. At this point, we're going to leave our contact information up here. We do have the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie, I didn't quite get the whole, they have a long acronym. Eastern Tallgrass Prairie and Big Rivers LCC website has a page that they've been kind enough to put some of our information on the prairie restoration page. So if you want, you can go and find additional information about PRI, and there's a place there to get on a broader mailing list for people who are just interested in prairie restoration in general. And then if you're more particularly interested in PRI, Paul Charland is the other co-coordinator who maintains our mailing list. And then, of course, I, Amanda, am the person to ask about if you have questions about the database or want to talk about it or would like to get on a waiting list, and we'll as soon as we're ready to get more contributors, we'll get people in the loop.
And for those of you who are not really great at acronyms, LCC means Landscape Conservation Cooperative.
Okay, well I think that wraps it up on our end, and we'd love to have questions or comments from any of you.
Yeah, thanks. If anybody has questions or comments, you can feel free to click on the chat box and type something in, and we can make sure everybody can understand the questions. So just to kind of recap again, if people want to get involved, there's different email addresses here for different things. But how, so you were saying, Amanda, that it's probably a month out for the database?
Yes.
Okay. And people are going to start using it in batches, right?
Exactly, exactly. And that's to help our workflow, and then if we run into problems, so that we can troubleshoot things.
It's a new database, and anybody who's ever worked with developing a database will probably have a little bit of forgiveness at our lab of being able to pin down a date, because there's just things that come up that we can't really predict. And it's got a lot of information in there. We really want to have this be usable for you when you get it. So there's
it's on SharePoint, right? So that's
exactly
how people are going to access it.
Yeah. And I'm the person who can help people gain access to SharePoint,
right? Because
it's restricted to DOI unless you get a special partner permission.
And for people who would like to have, Amanda and I were talking, and there may be some people who aren't really sure if they want to participate or not in the database. That's okay. That's all right. You can just do the participate by vicariously, I guess. But the other thing, if you would like to know a little bit more on this website that Amanda provided here, there's a couple of videos that we will be posting within a matter of days. They're not on there right now, but one of them explains what the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is, and the other one explains the database a little bit. So please feel free to share those, and they'll be up on that website soon.
Great. Well, I'm sure people will have questions afterwards and from YouTube too. So I don't see any questions coming in. I've been trying to promote it in the DNR. I know a lot of people are talking about it and getting excited about it. So it's good to hear more about the database.
Yeah, we have had a lot of interest from a number of organizations and from individual landowners. We are certainly inviting people who are dedicated amateurs as well to record their data. We have, I think, right now about 38 organizations that are involved in one way or another. And we had a meeting a couple of years ago, and the attendance at that meeting just blew us away. There were far more people than we expected to attend, especially considering it was in Fergus Frostbite Falls, Minnesota, and it was in January. And we had a lot of people, I think something like 78 different organizations represented, and 150. We were thinking about 75 people would attend at most, but it was more than what we thought. And since then, we have, I think each of us who've been in the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative have talked with people who appreciate that this is a tool that's been probably needed for a long time. It's a way that we can learn faster. We could try to do work on our own land and not do this big sharing thing, but if we get a lot of information from a lot of people, we have faster learning. So please join us.
Yeah. And Amanda, I know we talked about this before, but as far as maybe people are thinking, oh, I don't know if I have all the data to enter into the database. I mean, they can contact you certainly and find out what kind of data needs to go into the database, or, you know, what if they don't know the land use history, right? You don't have to have all of those.
Exactly. So much of what I talked about there is actually optional, because you may not know, especially for something that was in the past. So yes, there's only a few things on each form are actually required, and that mostly has to do with just making sure that we have each site linked up to, you know, so that we understand which site belongs in with which refuge or conservation area or whatever. Yeah, and you know, Jessica, I have a list of the fields that we're asking for, and so I thought I didn't send it to you before the talk, but I'll send you a fact sheet and that list of fields, and then you can disseminate it to your group. So then I have more of an idea of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, that'd be great. So Phil Dahl's wondering, will you be able to capture weather data?
Yes. Yes, we're planning on bringing, automatically bringing weather data in based on location. So that will be something that, through the magic of computer wizardry, we plan to draw in. Some people have, at the National Wildlife Refuge where I'm stationed, I think there's probably about 5 different weather stations, but not everybody has that kind of data. So what we will do is pull it in from the nearest reporting weather station.
Yeah, great. And ultimately, if I know you said, Pauline, that if people don't want, that you shouldn't feel stifled by having to collect monitoring data, but if you want to collect monitoring data, it'll eventually be another layer.
Right, it will be another layer, but it also provides people with automated reports. Right. So as soon as you enter that data, if you've been, if you have information about your site, it will feed back to you some pieces of information that that will serve as good records about where you are right now.
Right. Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, there are. Thank you both so much, Pauline and Amanda, for sharing this exciting project with us. Next up after Thanksgiving, we have Julia Leone and Patrick Penarola, both graduate students, working on a project involving the effects of fire versus grazing on prairie butterflies and bees. So tune in after Thanksgiving. Thanks to everyone who joined today. Thanks to our panelists, and have a great couple weeks.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.